Folks, today we're going to be working on the second recording having to do with the review for the biology end of course exam. We'll be working on a second set of questions that were taken from the 2017 released STAAR test. So let's get started. This first question says, the picture shows a student using a microscope to study a prepared slide of a single-celled organism. A single-celled organism can be classified as a prokaryote based on the absence of. So this question is asking you if you can tell the difference between, the basic difference rather, between a prokaryote and a eukaryote. And the difference between the two is basically that a eukaryote has organelles inside of it. It's a cell. Eukaryotic cell belongs to a eukaryote, which means it's a multiple-celled organism, and each cell has organelles in it, the most prominent one being the nucleus. A prokaryote does not have a nucleus. So the correct answer for this particular question would be D. A single-celled organism can be classified as a prokaryote based on the absence of a nucleus. This question says different types of mutations can occur in DNA. The diagram represents a type of mutation. So within this test, you're going to be expected to interpret diagrams, drawings, charts, graphs, pictures that may be provided, all kinds of different images. If you look at this sequence on this DNA, the one on the left is the one prior to or before the mutation. So if we remember that these DNA sequences occur in groups of 3, the first group says GAC, the second group says TAG, the third group says CAC. If we look at after the mutation what happened, we notice that it says GAC, which that part copied correctly, but then we have C and a double A. So in other words, there was an insertion of an extra A for some reason, and then the G and then CAC. So if we look for the statement that best describes the mutation in this diagram, the answer is going to be J. A base was inserted into one strand of the DNA. On this particular diagram, we've got a picture of a shark with a remora, and it explains in the problem what a remora is. A remora is a fish that has an adhesive disc on the back of its head that it uses to attach itself to a large shark. When food floats away from the shark's mouth as it feeds, the remora collects the scraps. Drawings of a remora, or a shark rather, with a remora attached and a remora's adhesive disc are shown below. So it shows the top view of the fish. That's kind of hard to figure that that would be the back of its head, basically, and then it attaches to the shark. So this is asking you about different relationships that we see in nature. The first one says predation. That would not be correct because there's no predator involved here. We've got two organisms that are coexisting. We've got to figure out what the relationship is. Parasitism, the remora doesn't take anything away from the shark, so it's not a parasite. So that would not be correct. Commensalism, this is actually the correct answer because commensalism means that you've got two organisms coexisting. One of them benefits and the other one neither benefits nor does it have any harm done to it. And they are not in competition for the same foods, so that's why D would not be correct. This question says, invasive plant species affect the interactions of living and non-living components of an ecosystem. So the removal of invasive plants is often necessary. The goal of most plant control methods is to disrupt or inhibit the function of different plant systems. For example, insects can be used to chew through roots in order to reduce a plant's ability to absorb water. Now, which of these functions would most immediately be affected by a reduction in water uptake by the roots? And the answer to this one is J, photosynthesis. The plant has to have plenty of water in order to perform photosynthesis. to create the glucose that's created in the process of photosynthesis. And if you reduce the water uptake, then that's going to immediately affect the ability of the plant to continue with that process. Number 5, this picture shows a pika, which is a small mammal found in grassland ecosystems. The vast grasslands of the Tibetan Plateau are home to the plateau pika. So this is not in Texas, this is in Tibet, which is part of Asia, right? So it says the numerous pikas are prey for many predators of the grasslands, which serve as a major watershed for much of the area. So a watershed, you would need to know, means that it drains water off of areas that, for whatever reason, need to be drained. It could be because they flood easily, it could be because of major rainfall, whatever. It says the watershed drains large quantities of groundwater during the rainy season, or it's also called the monsoon season. Pikas have extensive burrows that help drain groundwater rapidly and are used as nesting sites by many bird species. However, many people advocate the eradication of the plateau pikas because they compete with livestock for grass. So anytime you have an established ecosystem, which this one is, and you remove something from it, it's going to disrupt the ecosystem. So it's going to cause what we would consider instability or make it become unstable. So the first thing we want to look at is which of these most likely would happen if the plateau pikas are completely removed from the Tibetan Plateau grasslands. So you've got 4 different choices here. 2 of them say the ecosystem is going to become more stable. So you could automatically, at the very beginning of this, rule out B and D because it's not going to become more stable, it's going to become less stable. So let's look and see what it says with regard to A and C. So C says the ecosystem will become unstable because the predators will migrate to nearby ecosystems, the birds will nest in nearby trees, and the soils will be aerated, which means they'll be kept from becoming compacted by other small mammals. Well, there weren't any other mammals mentioned in this. It says this is a grassland, so that would not mean that there are nearby trees. And the predators would migrate to nearby ecosystems. Well, they might or they might not. So let's look and see what A says. The ecosystem will become unstable because the predators will have fewer prey. That's true. The birds will have fewer nesting sites. That's true as well, because as long as the pika are there, they're keeping those nesting sites, those tunnels, open. But once they're gone, those tunnels would collapse and the area downriver would become vulnerable to flooding because without the burrows or the tunnels to aerate the soil and provide drainage during the monsoon rains, then you're going to have flooding happen downriver from there or down in lower areas from there. So the best answer on this one is A. Albinism is an autosomal recessive condition, which means that it's not a sex-linked trait. It can be in any gene. It's carried in what we call somatic cells. But it says that what you're supposed to do here is determine which circle graph shows the genotype probability when an albino female mates with a male that is heterozygous for the albinism trait. Well, even if you didn't know anything about how to read the genotypes to figure out which one was the albino and which one was heterozygous, there's only one circle here that shows 2 individuals, and that is circle F. Circle H shows 1, circle J shows 1, and circle G shows 3. And there aren't 3 people involved here or 3 organisms involved here. There are only 2. So that would automatically, by exclusion, mean that the correct answer is F. Sometimes it's really just that simple if you just will look at it and say, well, heck, there's only one male and 1 female here, so the only answer can be F. Number 7, the part of the cell cycle that is shown is a part of the cell cycle is shown in this simplified model. So if we just look at the diagram, we see two nuclei, one on the left, one on the right in that first upper left-hand picture. And then we see the arrow pointing to the one where it's starting to pinch in the middle to start to separate the cell. And then we see it completely pinching through in the bottom right-hand corner. And then if you go back left, you see two complete cells by themselves. And so this is showing the completion of cell division. That one's pretty straightforward. I don't think you could assume that it would be anything else. Okay? So the correct answer would be B. This one is a little bit, it looks very technical, but I want you to know that you can figure this out, even though they've got all of these sources and all of this interesting stuff on here from a journal of biology back in 1976 and whatever. Let's just read the question, okay? It says I think that's pronounced TAC, T-A-Q, TAC polymerase is an enzyme used in polymerase chain reactions to replicate fragments of DNA. Okay, that sounds very technical, but what it's basically saying is this is an enzyme that helps to replace DNA when it's broken. That's basically what it means. A study published in 1976 examined the properties of TAC polymerase after the enzyme was isolated from Thermus aquaticus, a thermophilic bacterium that lives in the hot springs of Yellowstone National Park. Well, that sounds quite technical as well, so let's back up and figure out what they're saying here. The study was published in 1976. They were able to find a bacteria that was called Thermus aquaticus, and it's thermophilic, which means it loves heat. And there are some bacteria that are like that. They can't live in places that are too cool. So these live specifically in the hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. So the graph shows one of the results of the study. And we look at the enzyme activity and we look at the temperature. So the temperature is on the x-axis, left to right, and the enzyme activity is on the y-axis. And as the line goes up, the activity increases. And if you notice, it goes up, starts going up a lot at 60 degrees, and at 80 degrees, it's really high, and then it starts coming back down at 100 degrees. So what that is showing you is there's just a very narrow range where this enzyme can work, because if it's too cool, it's not active, and if it's too hot, it's not active. So it says which statement about the enzyme activity is best supported by this graph? And if you scroll down and look at choice H, it says an enzyme functions best under specific temperature conditions. That one is the correct answer. But it said, F doesn't have anything to do, nothing is shown on there. An enzyme must be composed of multiple polypeptides or subunits to be active. That's not discussed or shown on that graph. An enzyme's rate of activity increases with time. Time isn't on that graph. It's simply temperature and activity. And J says an enzyme works equally well in bacteria that are adapted to high temperatures and in eukaryotic cells such as human cells. Well, this doesn't have anything about humans on it. It's only talking about bacteria, right? So that's why H would be the best answer. Number 9 says the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, often infects and destroys CD4 T cells. These CD4 T cells are one of many kinds of white blood cells that are an important part of the immune system. So if we think about what the immune system does in our bodies, it's what helps to keep us healthy, protects us from things like viruses and bacteria, right? So it says the most common danger related to the destruction of CD4 T cells is what? So if we destroy part of the immune system, that means we're not going to be as protected as we were before. So A says something about blood pressure. Blood pressure isn't part of the immune system. B says an increase in the threat of diseases caused by microorganisms and viruses, and that is the correct answer. Both C and D talk about blood flow and oxygen flow to tissues. That doesn't have anything to do with HIV. either. It doesn't affect the circulatory system. Now, if it were a question about something that affected the circulatory system that was inherited, then you might have an option here at a couple of different answers that are correct. But this is not like sickle cell anemia would be. C and D would be with important in that. But this is not talking about sickle cell. This is talking about HIV. Common baboons live in the savanna in breeding groups called troops. While females tend to stay with the troop, younger or less dominant males may leave to join a neighboring troop. Which of these is a likely outcome of movement by young males? So you've got young males that may leave a troop and young males from another troop that might come in. And as a result of that, you're going to have a gene flow. In other words, you're going to have new genetics being brought in and genetics leaving your troop or a single troop and going to another troop. So it's going to be F is the right answer. Gene flow occurs between populations. So you have young ones leaving and other young ones coming in, and that way you keep the gene flow going. You don't have too much inbreeding, which is a healthy thing for the populations. An estuary collects sediments from the ocean and riverbeds that feed into it. So a fancy word for, or a kind of a more common word for estuary is a fancy word for it, is a swamp. So when you have a swamp, you have sediment from the ocean and you have rivers that are emptying into this area. And the sediments swirl around and eventually settle to form a mud flat. And then eelgrass is established, which means it starts to grow on the mudflat. The ecosystem changes over time and eventually develops into a salt marsh that contains mangrove trees. So this is a process that we know of as succession. And in this case, when you're talking about a new area where nothing has grown before, this is going to be it's not going to be primary succession because this area already has living things there. It's got seeds that come in that are brought in. It doesn't have to be, in primary succession, we have bare rock that has to be broken down into soil. In this case, we've already got the soil. It's coming from sediments from the ocean and sediments from the rivers. And so this would be an example of secondary succession, actually. But then it says, which of the following is not likely involved in this example of ecological succession? So it says not likely, right? Or likely not. The rotting remains of plants add fertility to the soil. That's going to be correct in any ecosystem. When you have plants that rot, the elements that make them up get added back to the soil or to the air. The soil becomes so fertile that the eelgrass is replaced by other plant species. That would also be correct because as the eelgrass dies, it's going to add fertility to the soil. The roots from plants help stabilize the sediment, keeping it in place. This is true in any ecosystem. That's the function of plants. They keep the soil or the sediment in place. And the concentration of salt becomes so high that all plant life is destroyed. The only time that might happen would be in the event of some kind of disaster, like, a hurricane or something that would cause flooding and then it might wipe out everything. But still, it would not take long to come back. So the correct answer to this one, the one that is likely not involved, is going to be D. 12 says differences in traits such as hair texture are determined by differences in, and we know that DNA is what creates all of the genes in your body, and the sequences on that DNA are what create hair color, skin color, eye color, height, bone density, freckles or no freckles, the size of your ears, the shape of your ears, the size of your feet. It controls everything, right? So when you're talking about the DNA, it's going to be the sequence of the nucleotides in the DNA. It's not going to be the location of sugar groups because that's part of the structure, but that does not carry information. It's not going to be the number of nitrogenous bases because the number of bases are the same in everyone. It's the sequence that makes the difference. And the molecules attached to the phosphate do not affect your genetics either. Okay, so it's going to be the sequence of nucleotides. Number 13 says students were given a list of 7 elements and asked to identify the 4 elements that are most abundant in biomolecules, and which table correctly identifies the 4 most abundant elements in biomolecules. Now we have 4 basic biomolecules. We have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins, and we have nucleic acids. Now, proteins and nucleic acids go together because nucleic acids actually form proteins. And those 2 groups have one element in common that the other 2 groups do not have, and that's nitrogen. So if you can remember, protein ends in nitrogen, nucleic acid starts with nitrogen. Both of those have nitrogen in them, but they also have 3 elements that all of them, so all of them contain carbon. So we're talking about carbohydrates, fats, proteins, nucleic acids. They all contain carbon, they all contain hydrogen, and they all contain oxygen. The 2 that contain nitrogen contain one extra element, right? They contain nitrogen, but they also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right, so that would make the correct answer here would be A. This one is another one, says the graph, so you got to interpret the graph, shows the number of taxa of reptiles whose fossilized tracks have been found. So we're looking at ancient tracks, like if you've ever been down to Glen Rose here in Texas, near Granbury. Glen Rose has a dinosaur park where you can actually go down and look at tracks that are in the river that are, from a very long time ago. Probably the Jurassic period, maybe the Cretaceous period. I'm not sure. I haven't been down there in almost 40 years, but I understand after 40 years they're still there, and that makes sense because 40 years is nothing when you're talking about millions and hundreds of millions of years ago, right? So it says, which statement is best supported by these data? So let's look at what it shows first of all before we look at the statements. It's always a good idea to think about what's shown here. So if you look at the early to late Permian, it looks like the number of tracks dropped, right? And that's the first section. The second section says early to late Triassic. It looks like the number of tracks went up considerably. It maybe have even quadrupled, right? The next one says early to late Jurassic. My gosh, it was way up at somewhere around probably 130 tracks, and it dropped all the way down to somewhere around 13, maybe 12, 13 tracks. So there must have been a huge something that happened there to cause all of these things to die off. And then if you look to early to late Cretaceous period, then that one shows at the early point, there were some, and then it dropped off just a little bit. So it says, competition for food and shelter was very low during the Triassic period. Well, the Triassic period looks like they might have had, I don't know, there's nothing on there about competition. If there were, it looks like it would make it drop, not increase, right? A great extinction occurred during the Jurassic period, so that means a great die-off. Does that look like that could be possible? It does to me. So I think I would choose G if there's not something better. H says environmental conditions for speciation, so that means forming different species, were most favorable during the Permian period. And the Permian period showed that they dropped off. They died off, but not as much as they did in the Jurassic period, so that one would be out. And it says reptiles for J. Reptiles adapted to a terrestrial environment during the Cretaceous period. Well, it doesn't show anything about terrestrial versus aquatic on there, so I would say the best answer here is going to be G. The picture shows bean-shaped glands called nodes. Now you got to think about in your body, we have nodes Sometimes they swell up in your neck when you're not feeling well. Sometimes they swell up under your arms when you're not feeling well. They just get a knot. It's kind of sore under there. Sometimes that happens in your groin. Sometimes it happens at the back of your knee. So there are lots of different places in your body where there are these nodes. It says the clusters of cells in nodes include macrophages. That's a particular kind of cell that break down viruses and potentially harmful materials. So when those lymph nodes, those nodes get inflamed and they get swollen, that's because the macrophages are trying to kill something in your body that's potentially harmful. It says the nodes also contain cells that produce protein particles capable of capturing harmful materials that flow in the tissue or in tissue fluid through the nodes. So different parts of the body are drained by nodes in different regions of the body. Which body systems are directly responsible for regulating these nodes and protecting the body from harmful materials in tissue fluid? So if it's keeping you healthy, it's got to have something to do with the immune system. And these nodes are actually part of the lymphatic system, all right? So the lymphatic system is actually part of your circulatory system. It's kind of a little part separate from the circulatory system because it only drains a little bit of your blood through those nodes at a time to keep your blood supply clean. So it couldn't be digestive or nervous. It couldn't be endocrine or digestive, and it certainly wouldn't be nervous system. So you've got to look to see on these when you have something that answers both answers are correct. And so for that particular question, the answer is going to be A. Here's another diagram, and it says this diagram demonstrates why the ocean is a large carbon sink. Now what that means is that carbon in various forms is collected in the ocean and held onto. All right, so we have precipitation, we have sea ice, we have the wind. All of these things affect the surface of the ocean in addition to sunlight. And it shows that CO2 is used by phytoplankton. So phyto means light, plankton, little tiny microscopic plants in the ocean, they are going to be using the CO2 in photosynthesis. And then as they die, they become part of the organic matter that sinks to the bottom, and they hold on to that CO2 because they used it. They hold on to that carbon. So then when it gets down into the bottom of the ocean, you notice it says in the middle that cold water holds more CO2 and warm water holds less CO2. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is there is circulation in the oceans that goes very deep, and we have these decadal turnovers. Decadal means like every 10 years or more it takes for ocean water that's very cold to rise because of ocean currents to rise to the top, to be warmed enough that it comes up and it lets go of CO2. So when the ocean water gets warm, more CO2 is released. So let's see if we can find something that says something to that effect, okay? Because you've got to figure out what this picture is showing you. It says less carbon dioxide would be available to phytoplankton. Well, that's not true. More CO2 would be, more carbon dioxide would be available as more of it is released. G says dissolved carbon dioxide gas in the ocean would increase because the surface winds would cause a deeper circulation pattern, making more room for the gas. Well, that's not true. The more wind we have, the more it circulates the ocean, so the more it's going to cause a disruption and cause, turnover, basically. H says less carbon dioxide gas would be contained in the ocean because increasing precipitation would dilute the carbon entering the ocean. That's not true because the carbon entering the ocean has nothing to do with the rain. Unless it's bound up to the rain and it's making carbonic acid and dropping it in the ocean, which it doesn't do, then the rain is not going to affect it. It says on J, less carbon dioxide would be dissolved in the ocean because increasing atmospheric temperatures could cause ocean temperatures to increase, and that would be the one you want to choose. All right. Go to the next one. Which molecule synthesized by plants is a major source of energy for cellular processes in both plants and animals? So the major source of energy for cellular processes that comes from photosynthesis is a sugar. And when we're looking for a sugar, because that's what all plants and all animals use for energy, you want to look for something that ends in OSE. The names of all sugars end in OSE, and the only one here that ends in OSE is glucose. All right, so glucose is what our cells use. We eat everything that we eat to eventually break it down into one of two things, either glucose or protein. So even the fats that we eat eventually get broken down either into glucose. Well, they don't get broken down into a protein, but they get broken down into glucose. All right. This last question that we're going to cover today has to do with DNA again. And notice we've got a diagram here to interpret. So we've got a fruit fly and a DNA sequence from a gene, and a frog and a DNA sequence from a gene. And it says strands separate when mixed and heated. And then it says recombined fruit fly and frog sequence. So let's read what the paragraph of the question says. Researchers combined sequences from fruit fly DNA from a gene for a particular trait with frog DNA. And the mixture was heated to separate the DNA strands, and cooling allowed the single strands to form pairs. The researchers observed that some of the fruit fly DNA paired with frog DNA. So that's what this diagram shows, right? And it says the results provide evidence that there are similar nucleotides present in both fruit fly and frog DNA. That's going to be the correct answer. But let's look at the others to see why they might be incorrect. Fruit flies and frogs can be made to develop some of the same physical characteristics. Well, no, I don't think so. You're not going to make a fly make the sound of a frog while it's flying around and buzzing around your food, right? That's not going to happen. H, heat can cause mutations in DNA sequences of organisms. Actually, heat doesn't usually cause mutations. It either destroys the DNA or it causes it to separate into two strands. And J, the replication of genetic material can occur at any temperature. This doesn't tell us what temperature they heated it to or anything else. So I would strike that one off just because it doesn't give that detail in the problem itself. So I hope this was helpful. There are going to be 2 more videos upcoming, so make sure that you watch them all to get some support looking at practice questions from released tests from 2017, 2018, and 2019. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.